Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I'm your host, Shane Phillips. This week we're joined by Lan Deng, who's sharing some of her research on housing reforms in China over the past 40 or 50 years, and on some of the outcomes of those reforms in more recent decades. Because of that broad scope, we cover everything from the reforms in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that transitioned China from a state-run to a market-based housing model, but also some of the 21st century government interventions in response to the global financial crisis, a growing need for affordable options for low-income urban residents, the shock of COVID, and retrenchment after many years of over-reliance on the development industry to prop up the Chinese economy as a whole. China's housing market is in many ways very different from those of Western nations, and its political system is more different still, so there are limits to the lessons we can draw from it. But as you'll hear, there are also more similarities than one might expect, and the differences are worth learning about as well. Lan makes a really interesting point that the way people respond to rising incomes is broadly similar across many countries. Demand increases for larger and better appointed homes. At the same time, how that housing is supplied varies widely due to different institutional and political contexts. We can learn from those different approaches that may never have been tried or even dreamed of locally, even if we can't usually transfer them wholesale from one country to another. I always learn a ton in these broad historical overview episodes, and I love hearing about how different places tackle often very similar problems to our own, and I hope you do too. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, with production support from Claudia Bustamante, Jason Suteja, and Gavin Carlson. If you have a question or show idea, send it to me at shanephillips@ucla.edu. With that, let's get to our conversation with Lan Deng. Lan Deng is professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Michigan, and she's joining us today to talk about China's housing market and the ways it's changed and been reshaped over the past several decades, and a bit about where things stand today. Lan, thanks for joining us, and welcome to the Housing Voice podcast.
Thank you, Shane.
And my co-host today is Paavo. Hey, Paavo.
Hey, Shane. How's it going? Good to see you, and I'm so excited to see you, Lan, and you're joining us for this podcast. I've appreciated your research for a long time. It was very useful when I was living in Hong Kong, trying to learn about Chinese urbanism and housing. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you both. My pleasure.
So, Lan, we always ask our guests for a quick tour through a city or a neighborhood that they've lived in or live in now that they know well. Where do you want to take us?
So that's a good question. So I want to talk about the city of Chongqing. I actually didn't grow up there. I grew up in a small town that's about 2 or 3 hours by the high-speed train from Chongqing. But Chongqing used to be part of the Sichuan province of where I grew up. My parents now live there, so I have been visiting it many times in the past 2 decades. It's a very interesting city, and basically just in terms of its geography, I think it's pretty famous. I'm sure Paavo and Shane, you have also know about this.
I remember there was these articles where they would say, it's the biggest city you've never heard of. Exactly. Until then, everybody has heard of it now.
Yeah.
This was true of me until I think 2 years ago. I don't think I had really heard of it, or at least I maybe seen the name but knew nothing about it.
It's now known.
Yeah, it's a mega city. It has a population, the administrative area that include both the core city and the suburbs that has 30 million people. So that's probably why people say it's the largest city in China. But the core city area has about 8 million, which is still huge, right? Yeah. So it's kind of very interesting. It's sitting at the intersection of 2 major rivers, but also surrounded by mountains. The entire city was built along the edge of the mountains. So sometimes people say it's a mountain city. Mm-hmm. And I find very interesting is because, the city used to be an old industrial city. It has a lot of manufacturing plants. A lot of the manufacturing plants were built in the mountains in the 1950s, 1960s. Because it was viewed as very safe. It would be difficult for enemies to invade, right, to occupy those places. So there were a lot of industrial use before. But then in the last several decades, so many of those plants were moved outside the core area, and the core city has really transformed itself. So has a very, now I would say, has very diverse and dynamic economy. And there's a lot of development, of course, just like many other Chinese cities. And those development, you see those high-rise buildings dispersed through these hills, and also kind of the subway lines. One incredible thing is that one subline actually runs through an apartment building. So the apartment building was built around the subway station. You probably have seen some of those pictures like this. But what I have found interesting is that even though with all this development, the city has really done a very good job of preserving many of its old neighborhoods. And I really just like its big city, but it's not as overwhelming like Beijing or Shanghai. It's every time I visited, it still gave me this hometown feeling. And of course, it's food, right? It's also known for its kind of spicy cuisine and hot pot in particular. So you can probably walk into a hot pot restaurant like every 10 or 15 minutes. There are just so many of them in the city. It's just so fun. Every time I went there, there's so many interesting things that we can do. Yeah, I look forward to seeing it again this summer.
I want to go there with you. It sounds so fun. I have, I really love that region of China, and the food is delicious. And also, I think, I understand Chongqing was really a pioneer in kind of giving migrants more rights to urban amenities and kind of doing some political stuff that was pretty innovative for a major Chinese city. Is that right?
Yeah, it probably built more affordable housing units than any other Chinese cities did.
Is it also the city where I think I've seen videos of these high rises? You'll have like an entrance on one side, maybe on the kind of like downslope side of the mountain, and you enter at the ground floor, and you can come out on the ground floor at the opposite side of the building, and you're at like 10 stories up, that kind of thing. And they've just got that throughout.
It's very hazy.
Like how they tie that all together is incredible.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there are a lot of miracles of I would say, urban development in the city. It's very interesting. Yeah.
So this week's article is titled Market Development, State Intervention, and the Dynamics of New Housing Investment in China. And it was published in the Journal of Urban Affairs with Jie Chen back in 2019. The study describes a range of market reforms and state interventions taken by China's government over many years, and it measures how responsive investment into housing development has been to rising prices there. This is the price elasticity of housing investment. Normally, we would expect a market-based economy to increase housing investment when prices are rising and decrease investment when prices are falling, and that would give us a positive number in either case for the price elasticity. Investors will jump into a market when they see prices rising, and they'll exit when they're dropping. That all makes sense. But while China has instituted a lot of market-oriented reforms, I don't think it's what most people would call a market economy. And so there's a question about how much its housing market follows that overall trend. It's a different kind of market economy. I see you waving your head back and forth.
Market economy with Chinese characteristics, yeah.
Yes. So the study period is 1999 to 2013, but part of why we were interested in this topic is the more recent turmoil in China's real estate market, which has been making global news. So we're going to get ourselves a good foundation in the history of China's housing reforms, but also try to talk a little bit about more current events. In case I need to explain why we're interested in China's housing market, I think 3 points will suffice. First, although China's overall economy is about 3/4 the size of the U.S. economy, it invests about twice as much as we do into housing. It is just a much bigger share of the economy there. And this gives us one view of the possible consequences of that, albeit within a very different economic and political structure. Second, the Chinese Communist Party is generally much more willing to intervene in markets and much more forcefully than most other nations, and their experience may have lessons for how other national governments should or could approach housing market interventions. And then third, China is home to 1.4 billion people, about a sixth of the world's population, and its urban population has been increasing by about 20 million people annually over the past decade, which is the equivalent of the entire population of Chile or the Netherlands moving from rural areas into cities each year. Building housing for these new city dwellers is obviously a huge challenge, and it is hugely consequential even beyond China's borders. So we're going to see what we can learn. So as I said, this study is about housing prices, housing development, and the relationship between the two in China. Before we talk about those details, though, Lan, I was hoping you could just first summarize some of the reasons you wanted to do this analysis. I shared a little bit of my own impression already, but in your own words, why did China's housing price elasticity, the responsiveness of housing investment to prices, interest you? Why is it important or useful to understand this better?
Yeah, so I have always been interested in studying housing supply. So as someone who has been studying housing economics for a while, several decades now, I feel that there's a lot of discussion about the housing demand, especially in the Chinese context. So we often hear people saying, well, the economic growth, right, the population growth, urbanization that have been driving Chinese housing market. But we didn't hear people talk about how housing is actually built. And I think this is, again, it's a case in China, but also for the housing studies in general, that there seems to be far less attention about housing supply issue. So that's kind of one of the reasons. Another reason I'm very interested in studying housing supply is because compared to housing demand, we know housing markets are affected by both demand and supply. Compared with housing demand, if we compare countries, right, across countries, there's a strong similarities in housing demand, I would say, across countries. Like for when countries, with economic growth, household income increase. So you can expect households would want better housing, larger housing. So the housing preferences are pretty similar across countries. But in terms of housing supply, the dynamics of housing supply can vary a lot from place to place because of the institutional context. In the U.S., for example, we talk a lot about the single-family zoning, but in China does not have this kind of single-family zoning. But China has its own issue, and the very important issue is about how urban land is supplied. So that institutional context, I find is very intriguing. So, Jie and I, my co-author Jie Chen and I, we work together on this paper. So we want to look into this issue about exactly what is the dynamics of housing supply in China. But then we decide to focus on measuring the price elasticity of housing supply because the value can tell us about how new housing investment has been responsive to housing price change. As she mentioned before, when housing price increase, we would expect more investment, right? We would expect more housing production. But by what degree, right? Whether this increase is enough in accommodating the increased housing demand. So we want to know that, then we will be able to figure out, okay, if we are saying that there is an increase in housing price, what is driving that increase in housing price? And if our measurement shows that the elasticity value is high, and that means that with the increase in housing price, which is probably the result of increasing housing demand, then we can expect housing production, housing investment to increase significantly and to be able to accommodate this increased demand. And what that means that if we observe an increase in housing price, then that increase in housing price should reflect the underlying cost of development. So price increase would be driven by the cost of development, not driven by supply shortage. By contrast, if our measure shows that if the elasticity value is low, that means with increasing housing price, the increase in supply would be limited. And then that would be an indicator that, there is some problem with housing production, with housing supply, right? The housing supply is not able to increase sufficiently to accommodate the rising demand. And in that case, we could argue that the increase in housing price is very likely to diverge, to be different from the cost of development because of the supply shortage. Then I think that also gave us reason to think about then what actions we can take to address the housing affordability problem, especially in terms of controlling the rising housing price. So that's kind of some of our motivations in undertaking this study. We just feel that this is a very important indicator that need to be measured and that can give us important insights on how the housing market have worked in the Chinese context.
So throwing out all nuance here, is it fair to say that the price elasticity of housing supply, when it's higher, it's generally a sign that things are working as intended, that the supply is responsive to increasing demand, and the price of new housing is probably pretty close to the price of actually providing that housing. It doesn't have additional regulatory costs added to it. And as it gets lower, that's kind of a warning signal that maybe some reform is needed, something is going wrong.
Yeah, that's a good statement. Yes. So we would want the elasticity value to be high enough that shows that the housing supply system can respond to the changes in housing demand. A high value would indicate, yes, I think the housing sector would be able to produce enough housing to accommodate the changes in demand.
Got it. I'm sure there's also cases where a price elasticity of supply can be too high, but we will not worry about that right now.
Yeah.
And can I just jump in real quick, because you mentioned the comparative element of this study, and you don't really get into it in the study because it's beyond the scope of the paper, but I think it's noteworthy here we're talking about the kind of framing of China's urban development over the last decades. It's just extremely impressive to see the way formal housing has been built at relatively high densities with transit and road connections in a country that's urbanizing so rapidly. Because usually when countries are urbanizing rapidly and, developing economically, that's not the way cities grow, right? Cities are usually growing more with more informal development and kind of more scattered and less kind of regulated and less organized. Well, organized in a different way, right? And less by the state. And so I think, Chinese urbanization has been very impressive in that sense. I don't know if that's your perspective as well.
Yeah, I think so. So if we look at the development records, I think China has built millions of housing units within a relatively short period of time and, to accommodate population growth, migration, right? So I think that's very impressive. So overall, I think in our paper, we talk a lot about how housing reform has enabled this process, but we have to keep that in mind. And if we look at some of the living standards, in 1978, I think before China started its housing reform, the average living space per capita at that time was only about 6.7 square meters per capita. So That's about 67 square feet. But today, I think the average living space per capita for urban residents is about 40 square meters per capita. So it's almost like 6 times
Huge
as much.
Change, yeah.
It's a huge improvement.
And can you give us a sense for how much housing China has been building over the past few decades, and to the extent that we can measure it, like how much it needs?
So the thing about Chinese housing, it's very hard to count by the number of units because all the official statistics that the Chinese government is published about like the built area. So measure, I mentioned like square meters. So in general, I think China has been building about 1 billion square meters every year in the last 2 decades or so. So that's massive development. But they don't count this in like number of units, like what we say in the US statistics.
So that's 10 billion square feet. If each unit was 1,000 square feet, which would probably be large, maybe not, that would be 10 million units a year.
Yeah, there was some data that showed like 200 million new units between 3 decades.
Wow, that's a lot. Okay. In the US, I think we build somewhere on the order of 1 to 1.5 million a year on average. So this is about 5-6 times more, 7 times more in China over the past 30 years for a population that is 4 times larger, roughly. All right. So as I said, we want to talk about the history of China's housing market reforms so we can better understand how we got where we are today. You write that China's for-profit housing development industry started in the mid-1980s. Can you paint a picture for us of the housing landscape in the years before that transition began and some of the reforms that helped it move toward a more market-based system? Who built housing back then, and what problems was this transition intended to solve?
Yeah, so China started housing reform in the mid-1980s, as you mentioned, Shane. Before that, China was under what we call like welfare housing system. So the welfare housing system is part of the planned economy. Under the welfare housing system, housing was not a commodity. So it's not something that's traded on the market. There was no housing market. Instead, it was a component of the social welfare, and it was provided mostly for free by employers, which we call them as work units. And those work units include government institutions and state-owned enterprises. And so these work units, these employers, they have to provide housing mostly for free because the workers' salary was very low. And they also have to provide some other basic needs like public education, medical care. So the Chinese households, especially in the urban area, they had to rely on these work units for their housing. And the problem is that because the housing units was provided for free, that means they don't own housing. So these are rental housing. And so the rent households pay was very low. With a very low rent, the rental income often cannot even cover the basic operation, and basic management expenses. So as a result, you can imagine that those work units would not have the incentive to invest in housing development because the more they built, the more money they were likely to lose. And even also didn't have the incentive to maintain those units well. So as a result, the housing condition in China was pretty bad, before the reform in around the late 1970s. There was serious housing shortage. Overcrowding was common. And the physical condition of the units was also pretty bad. So that's the issue that the Chinese government was facing at that time, and a very important reason why they want to launch the housing reform.
Yeah, so I guess that this helps explain why there was about 6-7 square meters of space per person back in those days.
And as part of the reform, I think, it's we shouldn't not mention the land reform and the introduction of the 99-year lease. I don't know, maybe if you want to talk about 1978.
Yeah, so the land reform can go along with the housing reform. So land in China is state-owned. Basically, there are two types of land ownership. And the rural land is owned by the collectives, like villages, right? The farmers collective own the rural land. But all the urban land is owned by the state. And of course, housing was not a commodity, neither was land. So land was also provided, if you want to build housing, and then the government would allocate land for housing development. So that's before the reform, right? You cannot purchase land for housing development. There was no for-profit housing development. But so now the Chinese government want to promote a market housing industry. They want to have a professional real estate development industry. And then that means this industry will need to purchase land. So when land was state-owned, and in theory, you cannot own the land, you cannot purchase the ownership. So what happened in China is that in 1998, the Chinese government had launched the land reform by amending the constitution to separate the land use rights from the land ownership. So developers who want to build housing, they can purchase the land use rights, even though they will not be able to own the land. So they purchase the land use rights from local governments. And for housing development, so the land use rights can be purchased for 70 years. So they can build housing and then sell their housing units to urban households with land being leased. So that's how, the land has become a commodity. The land use rights is now traded on the market.
Yeah, I just remember my former colleague Anthony Ye at Hong Kong University I think he went to the first auction of land for leaseholds like in the 70s in Shenzhen. Yeah, and so he was telling me about that. And it's fascinating how that system that was from the British king owned all the land and would lease the use rights to people. It went through Hong Kong, and then China adopted this lease. I mean, I don't know if, maybe there were other places that were doing it where they got that idea, but it seemed like probably from Hong Kong.
Yeah, the Hong Kong housing system, land system has huge influence on China's housing and land reform. Yeah.
And then we don't have time to talk about this, and we don't know what's going to happen, but I think, in 40 years or something, we'll come back and talk about what happens when those 70-year leases, when the first leases come up. I think that's such a fascinating topic, but not today.
I do want to go back really quickly and just talk about the decision to institute market reforms and why the Chinese government felt like that was the direction to go. So I think people might wonder, it's the Communist Party. They're very strong on state-owned enterprises and so forth. I understand that the incentives with the work units were not aligned and were leading to both a shortage and low quality of housing. But why not have the government just build a lot more housing itself and have a dedicated arm to do that, or all of that, or most of that, rather than hand over a lot of this to the market? What was the rationale for that?
Well, because I think the old system was kind of for the government to build. So those state-owned enterprise and those government institutions, they were part of the government. And it turned out this did not work, right? So there was housing shortage and all the housing issues. Especially the more housing you build, the more money the government has to invest, in maintaining, operating this housing. So the Chinese government did not feel it has the ability to do that. So that's why in the early phase of the housing reform, some of the earliest efforts the Chinese government undertook was actually to privatize the existing public housing units so that the government did not need to continue investing in housing. It just didn't have the resources to properly maintain those units. Most of the public housing units were sold to the families living there.
So I guess there was probably a feeling of, we only have so much revenue, so many resources, and the market can provide housing without us subsidizing it for many people, not all. And so why not let it do that? And then they still have systems in place for assisting poor households and that kind of thing as well. And we can get into what those look like a little bit later. So previous research on the ability of countries to supply enough housing, especially during periods of rapid urbanization and development as China was experiencing, point to two particularly important factors, which you summarize as first, the nature of the development industry, and second, the availability of land. We talked a little bit about the first one and the shift toward more profit-driven, private, market-oriented development. And I think it is fair to say that over the years, China's development industry has grown more similar to industries and market economies like the US. The same cannot be said for land, which is controlled by the government in China, but mostly privately owned here in the US, at least in the cities in China. It's controlled by the government. Tell us a little bit more about some key facts about land ownership, and especially how land is allocated for real estate development in China. I think we haven't really touched on that yet.
So I mentioned about the land reform that separated the land use rights from the land ownership. So the land use rights could be traded. But in China, it's a local government that are in charge of selling those land use rights. So the local government, they can be viewed as representing the state. So they sell those land. And then developers who want to build projects, including market housing, they will have to purchase the land use rights from the government. And they actually purchase them from what we call an open land market. So the government would every year would release how much land it wants to sell and what kind of development would be allowed, and would actually publicly publish this information. And the developers will have to bid for this land. So there is this auctioning process. The one that offers the highest price typically will get the land. But of course, there are some variations, right? Sometimes, if the developers propose to do affordable housing development, and then they do not have to bid for land, so the government may provide them land at reduced price, or there could be some other consideration. But for most of the market housing development, the developers have to purchase land through this auctioning process, and those with the highest bid will get the land. So that's how the land is allocated to the highest and best use, whoever can offer the highest price.
Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that auction process and what the local governments use the money for. One thing that I always thought about when I was living in Hong Kong was like what a prudent monopolist the Hong Kong government had been for those many years of the colony. Because if you think about it, right, they owned all this, they had control of all this land and they were selling it to fund the government. But I always thought, like, why didn't they just sell it all in 1890 and like get all that money right away? So it's like pretty impressive that they're slowly selling it to keep the price high, letting just a few parcels every year to make sure that they have money for next year. So I don't know if that happens and how that kind of phenomenon works in China, in mainland China, in terms of how local governments think about the land auction process for housing and the role of that in the local government finances.
So the government wants to control the pace of land supply, right? As I mentioned before, that for this rural land, so land in the urban fringe area, they were first owned by the rural collectives, right? So the local government will have to acquire this land, get this land from the farmers first, and then they provide compensation at a fairly low cost because the compensation was calculated based on the agriculture use. And of course, agriculture use did not generate much income. So for much of the time, so the compensation was fairly low. But then once the government converts that land into urban land, then you can sell it to developers and it will sell based on the urban uses, right? Which would, of course, would be much more profitable. So the land typically would be sold at a much higher price. And then what that means that then the local governments can collect significant amount of revenue from those land sales. And this land sales revenue is a very important revenue source for local governments. In China, there is no local property tax. So there is no dedicated local revenue source for local governments. So land sales revenue basically function like the way that property tax revenue function for the U.S. government, for example. So that's very important to keep in mind. So local government rely on the land sales revenue to fund a lot of its activities. And also because some of the other revenue sources local governments collect, some other taxation revenues they collected, they have to share with the central government. But land sales revenue is one of the very few local revenue sources that local governments do not need to share with the central government. So they almost have complete control on how they can spend this money. And that's how the local governments have been using the land sales revenue to finance this massive infrastructure development that we have seen, as well as many other activities, even social welfare programs in China.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And, when I was living there was the beginnings of the discussion around introducing a property tax to like wean local governments off the reliance on land sales. How has that progressed? I mean, in a few cities, I know they introduced one, but I don't know if I haven't followed it and to see whether it was functional or not.
So the Chinese government experimented the property tax system, I believe, in Shanghai and Chongqing.
Right.
But it hasn't been implemented at a larger scale.
Yeah, because in the long run, at some point,
you need,
cities are going to grow less quickly. It seems like that's maybe starting to happen.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, though, because, Pavo, to your original point about how prudent the British government was with retaining ownership of land, the lease sort of allows you to repeat this process indefinitely, where you sell the land, the lease runs
you got to wait 70 years or 99.
But then you take ownership back and you get to sell it again with the building on it if it's still, worth keeping. It's a long process and so you still have to draw it out, but it's not a one-time thing, in theory, at least.
Right.
Yeah, but also, I think in terms of the revenue collection perspective, you also want to maintain the stability of the land price, right? You want the land price to be able to continue to grow, right? So that also gives the Chinese government incentive to maintain or restrict the supply of land at certain time points so that you can maintain the stability of your land price and from the revenue collection perspective.
And indirectly, I mean, I don't know if I've seen work on this or I've just heard people talk about this. It's also a way to keep densities of development fairly high. Because if you're restricting land, do you think that plays a role in terms of the density of new development? Or is that more regulatory? Or why is the density of development relatively high?
Well, land cost has increased very fast. Land cost in China has actually increased at a faster pace than housing price. Some of the research I have done showing that housing price in the last 2 decades ago had rising about 9% per year, but land price has been about 14% per year.
Wow.
So, with this rapidly rising land cost, of course, we can expect that developers will build at a much higher density, right, to offset the cost of land. So that does lead to much higher density development in the central area with pretty high land price.
Mm-hmm.
I was not aware that China generally did not have property taxes. And that kind of explains for me a little bit of the run up in prices and the speculation and everything, where it's just there's not as much holding costs for owning property. And even if it's kept vacant for some amount of time, but it's going up in value 5 or 10% every year and you're paying no taxes on it, then that's a pretty good investment, actually, for as long as the prices keep going up, which we're in a different situation now. But we see something similar in Canada and particularly in Vancouver, BC, where the effective property tax rate there is 0.25%. And you could just park your money there and get pretty wealthy just off the appreciation on your condo or home.
Before we move on, maybe we could talk a little bit about the state-owned enterprise developers. You have another very recently published paper that's fantastic. I read it today on the evolution of the housing development industry in China.
And we will put that in our show notes.
Yeah, everyone should read that. I was shocked to see what a small share they are now of the real estate development industry. It's something like from 30% to 1% of developers are state-owned enterprise. So maybe you can just describe for people that might not be familiar with that kind of developer what they are and how they differ from private developers.
Yeah. So when China first started the housing reform, China did not have a profit-driven real estate development industry, right? So I would say the early years of the developers that started to build housing for sale were actually we call a spin-off from state-owned enterprise or government institutions. So they were actually part of the existing institutions, right? The older institutions. So in the early years, these early developers, they were dominated by those state-owned enterprises, and some of them were collectively owned. Like some villages also created development companies to build housing in the villages, that they also see these opportunities. But of course, as the housing reform progressed, as the housing industry expanded, there have been a significant increase in the number of private-owned firms, right? Private firms. So the state-owned enterprises, many of them could not compete with the private firms. And also over time, the Chinese government also did not want many of the state-owned enterprises to be so heavily involved with real estate development. So there were also kind of requirements from the Chinese central government that these enterprises have to stop building housing, right? So that the housing can be built by private firms. So the share of state-owned enterprises in real estate development have become very small. Pavel, you mentioned today it's only about 1%. But consider that the total base, the there's a total of about 100,000 real estate development firms. Even 1% is still,
a lot.
I think in terms of number, is still quite significant. But I think even though the number has become small, and those state-owned enterprises actually pretty influential because they have this advantage, they're state-owned, they have all these ties, collections with the government, so that gave them advantages in terms of getting land or in terms of, getting loans from the banks. Mm-hmm. So as a result, even though the number of state-owned firms have become small, the ones that still exist tend to be very large. So if you look at the top 100 real estate development firms in China, 20 of them are state-owned. So the small number of real estate development firms play a much larger role than what the share indicate.
That's interesting. And then how much does the housing that they build differ from the housing that private developers build?
I do not see a significant difference in terms of the quality of housing or in terms of the size of the housing. I think, again, because they probably are much more likely to undertake large-scale development because, again, they probably are more likely to get, large piece of land. Especially, I think the access to land is critical. Yeah. State-owned enterprises, it'll be much easier for them to get land probably at some of the more desirable locations.
Yeah.
Are they more likely to build for low-income households, like below-market housing, that kind of thing? Or are they generally just kind of competing with the private folks?
I think it depends. Sometimes for some of the state-owned enterprises, the Chinese government requires them to provide more affordable housing. It's also easier for the government to require those state-owned enterprises to build affordable housing than private firms. So that has been the case. But I haven't seen data on exactly how many more affordable housing units they have been building.
And I promise I didn't bring this line of questioning up just to mention the paper that I wrote on state-owned enterprise developers in Chengdu. But I did write a paper on state-owned enterprise developers in Chengdu. And it was, it's a great paper. You should check it out, audience. But
we cited your work.
Yeah, I saw this. I was so excited to see that you said there's only 2 English language papers about this topic. And then mine was one.
Yeah.
But yeah, there were a lot of questions remained because we found, the main finding was because we were looking at transaction data and comparing state-owned enterprise developers to other kinds of developers. We find they were selling otherwise similar units using the data that we had, which was not a full set of observable characteristics, but like size and building size and location and all these other things at a lower rate. So like 7% less than private developers. And what we couldn't figure out was whether that was because they were getting cheaper land and had, connections with the government in a way that they could make the same profits by undercutting the market, or they were building maybe lower quality units in ways we weren't measuring.
I think it's probably more likely because of the lower land cost, or even just, they can acquire land probably much faster than private firms that also save cost. They do have a lot of, more advantages in that aspect.
They presumably also want to profit, but they don't really have like target rates of return like an investor would, correct? Or is that wrong? Do they also have private investors?
I haven't looked into that. It's very complex, how the funding source come from for the state-owned enterprise. Yeah.
But speaking of money, I think, one thing we haven't talked about yet is the banking system. And I wonder, how much the banking system shapes the housing investment and real estate development. Banks are owned by the government in China, and I imagine they are following 5-year plans in terms of where they want to lend more and where they want to lend less. So I don't know if that's something you looked into specifically, but maybe you could talk about how the banking system shapes this.
I look into this a little bit, to try and understand the real estate development process. So yeah, banks in China are still state-owned, right? And because they are state-owned, and the interest rate for deposits in China is very low. So that means the banks, they are collecting money, raising capital at a very low cost. That also means that when they issue these loans, with relatively low interest rate, right, compared to what developers can get from other sources. So being able to get a bank loan is a big deal for real estate developers. But at the same time, so the Chinese government, especially the central government, for a very long time has been very concerned about the over-reliance of the economy on real estate development. So it has been, the Chinese government have been well aware of the risks associated with this very, kind of excessive real estate development. So that's why the Chinese central government has very strict regulations on what bank can lend and at what rate, who they can lend. So there's a lot of requirements. The banks cannot just lend to anyone they want to lend. So they have to follow these requirements, and they have to make sure that loans were given to the developers who were perceived of lower risk. And most likely those will be very large developers or those state-owned enterprises.
Right.
But of course, the real estate development has been massive in China. So that means there's a lot of more development that probably have to get funding from other sources. They will not be able to get from the banks. So there also is other sources of funding for development projects.
Yeah, and I imagine the banks are the lowest cost source of funding, certainly compared to any kind of private investor.
Yes.
All right, so we have a general understanding now, I think, of the housing development industry and the policies that are shaping it and how they've changed over time, and some of the ways that the local governments participate and shape it as well. A lot of your article centers on the national governments, the central government's response to the global financial crisis, which includes various policies and interventions since about 2007 or 2008. Could you give us a high-level summary of how the global financial crisis hit China, especially with respect to housing, and how the national government responded?
So the global financial crisis started in 2008, 2009, triggered by the mortgage foreclosure crisis in the U.S., right? So the mortgage foreclosure crisis sent the U.S. economy into a recession. And the Chinese economy at that time, even today, is still very much export-oriented. So that drop in global demand from the U.S. and also some other advanced economies. So that hit the Chinese economy pretty hard, right? The exporting industry was shrinking and the unemployment rate was rising. And so that also led to a contraction of domestic consumption. So the Chinese housing market also was hit hard. Before the global financial crisis, housing price in China was increasing every year at a pretty fast pace. But in 2008 was actually the first time the Chinese housing market saw a drop in housing price. So that was a pretty clear sign that the housing sector was in trouble and the economy was in danger of a severe recession. So the Chinese government has responded very quickly to that and realized first that it has to create as many jobs as possible and as quickly as possible. And then it identified that the housing industry, the housing development as a sector that would have the potential to help achieve that goal. So that's how the Chinese government, through various fiscal policy and direct investment, develop a massive stimulus package. I think some of the estimates is that about 4 trillion Chinese yuan in the stimulus money. And most of the money end up going to the real sector. I think a part of the reason was also because even before the financial crisis, the Chinese economy was had great momentum, right? The real estate industry, the housing markets were doing so well, were booming. And so this idea of government investment really can help boost the sector. And so the housing price, as a result of this, quickly resumed its growth and has actually, I think, increased by about 25% just within a single year in 2009. So that was very incredible. And of course, that also helped create a lot of jobs and help, pull the Chinese economy out of the recession.
Yeah, and I can imagine the appeal of development of construction, in particular because housing development tends to be very cyclical, where when the business cycle is in a strong stage, there's a lot of development, but then it dies off very sharply when things get weaker. But of course, the demand for housing is not as cyclical and people are still moving into the cities and everything. And so I think there's a real justification there. And so, this ties into the results of your analysis. So just getting started with some of these, you found that the price elasticity of housing investment was positive from 1999 up into 2008. And again, that is normal in a market-based economy. It means prices and investment are moving in the same direction. But after 2008, you find that the score turns negative. So prices fall, but investment actually increases. So the two are moving in different directions. I gather that this is an effect of the stimulus. I guess my question, though, is this a bad thing? We have stimulus for a reason. So is it a problem that the price elasticity turns negative, or how do you interpret that?
Yeah, so I think the negative sign was kind of puzzling to us first, because most of the papers we read before, most of the papers were studying the housing market dynamics in market economies that do not have such a strong state intervention that we saw in the Chinese context. So previous studies that examine price elasticity of housing supply often did not report a negative value. So ours was kind of very interesting. But I think then, if think about what really happened during those years, right, during the stimulus phase, we do believe that this negative sign just reflect what has happened, I think what the Chinese government have been doing, pumping those investment into the housing sector and with the stimulus, is to try to counter market forces, right? Because the market forces were bringing the economy down. So this government investment was to work in the opposite way as what the market logic would suggest. So with the price going down and there was more investment, even though the investment came from the government and some of the other fiscal policies. But then when the price has resumed its growth, the market has recovered, and then those government stimulus package has faded off. So we saw a decline in this huge investment into the housing sector. So yeah, we do believe that this sign reflects how the housing sector was functioning in the opposite direction as what the logic of the market would predict.
Another interesting finding is how the results differ in the eastern region of China, where the economy is strongest in cities like Shenzhen, Beijing, and Shanghai, compared to other parts of China. You generally see lower price elasticity of housing investment in the east, meaning that prices do not translate into more development as much. And I think it's worth noting here that elasticities are also lower in coastal U.S. cities that built little housing relative to demand for the last few decades. In China, is this a problem of political, legal, administrative obstruction of permitting and building homes in that region, in the eastern region, compared to the others? Or is it just, maybe there's just so much growth, it's genuinely too hard to keep up with it? Or is it something else going on?
I think it reflects the fact that, superstar cities are located in the eastern region, right? Like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen. And the eastern region face a lot of development constraints. So I think our results just reflect the constraints that housing development face in those regions. And these constraints come from geography, the existing urban development pattern, but also come from, government policies with regard to the land supply. The eastern region is a region that already has a very high population density. So the density of development is already very high there. So the availability of land is limited compared to the cities in the rest of China. But at the same time, if we look at urban land supply, the amount of land that Chinese government allowed to be sold is also much less in the eastern region than the other regions. Part of the reason was because it just happens that some of the most productive farmland is also located in the eastern region. So a lot of the land use planning for the purpose of protecting farmland, that's also kind of very much focused on, protecting those farmland in the eastern region. So that also serves the purpose of limiting the amount of land for urban development. So there is just a lot more constraints for housing development in the eastern region than the other region. But of course, at the same time, the region also, like you mentioned, experience very strong growth. Yeah, it is just also impossible to keep up with this incredible amount of demand.
Yeah.
And is this partly connected to the Go West kind of efforts to develop, like from a national spatial planning perspective, to develop the center parts of the country?
I believe so. It's to spread the economic development to the rest of China so that, the development pressure is not just concentrated in the eastern region, but also because of, these rising regional disparities. Like if you just look at the housing price in the eastern region is so much higher than housing price in the other parts of the country. Yeah, so I think in general, the Chinese government want to see a more balanced regional development.
Right. Ironically, the two countries are doing the same thing in very different ways. The United States is pushing people to the center of the country by local land use regulations, and China is doing it through a national spatial plan. It's very interesting.
Yeah, we're not doing it intentionally.
On purpose. Intentionally, but yeah.
Yeah, and from the ground up rather than top down.
Bottom up national spatial planning.
So I think it's interesting to talk about affordable housing here and maybe compare to the US a little bit too. The Chinese government has made some very big commitments to affordable housing for its low-income urban population. And a passage from your article really stood out to me, which I'll read here. It says, quote, "In 2008, China pledged to provide affordable housing, mostly through new construction, for 7.47 million low-income urban households. Half a year later, the government doubled this goal to 15.4 million households. In 2011, the government announced a new plan to build 36 million affordable housing units in the next 5 years, accommodating about 20% of all urban households," unquote. So the goal went from 7.5 million units in 2008 to 36 million units 3 years later in 2011, almost a five-fold increase. I'm really interested to know how affordable housing works in China compared to the US or other Western countries, and what kind of progress they ultimately made on that 36 million unit goal. I wouldn't be surprised if the goal has increased further in the intervening years.
Well, yeah, so it was a very ambitious goal, right? So 36 million housing units within 5 years. And recent research has shown the Chinese government have achieved that goal. It has actually built more. From 2011 to 2015, China has built around 40 million affordable housing units. And the way that affordable housing development work in China is different from the U.S. in the sense is that the Chinese government set up the goal, so they put that goal. It's also part of their stimulus package, right? They're part of their plan to stimulate the economy. But then the Chinese central government allocates that goal to the lower level of government. It will show how much each province needs to build. And then the province government would then allocate to the even lower level government, how much every city has to build.
Is this sounding like our housing element process? Regional housing needs allocation, RHNA?
Except we do not fund it is the problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Chinese central government also didn't fund it to a very large degree. It asked the local governments to fund it. But the difference is that local governments have the control of land supply.
Right.
So the local governments, they have to show, especially the government officials, if they want to get promoted, they have to show that they were able to meet those goals. So that's also part of how their performance review. But local governments control the land supply. So they have to plan every year. They have to plan how much land to use for affordable housing development, as well as provide some of the other funding support. So that's a big issue. And it's every year. And they also have to report to the higher level of government about how many units have been built, how far they were from achieving their goals. And these reports were also publicly published. So that's how some of the housing scholars in China were able to add these numbers together and find that in general, I think this goal has been achieved. So it's a very top-down approach, but the fact that, the local government control the land supply and has this land sales revenue allow them to be able to fund affordable housing development. Local governments are required to allocate at least 10% of their land sales revenue to support affordable housing development. So that's one of the funding mechanisms for them to do it.
And we can link to some papers. I've seen some really good research on incentives for local government and different government officials in China, and how, it's this fascinating system where you want to do a really good job as mayor because then you can be promoted to, minister of trains or something, right? There is like a clear promotion system where, the motivations of mayors are very different from the motivations of mayors in U.S. cities.
Yes.
I'm curious how or who affordable housing serves in China, like, how it compares to like low-income housing tax credit housing in the US. And even that's like too broad a question, because in Los Angeles, a affordable housing unit funded by the low-income housing tax credit is rented at well under half of market rate. It's like 50%, 40% of market rate, give or take. If you're in a more affordable part of the country, maybe even where you're at, Lan, it might be closer to 70, 80%. It's still below market, but not quite as discounted. And so it's serving something of a different population. But who is really benefiting from the affordable housing? Who is it targeted at? Is it like deeply affordable, or is it kind of just a little bit below market? Does it vary a lot and serve lots of different populations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe we should go back to some of the history. I mentioned that before the housing reform, right, most of the urban households in China lived in housing provided by work units, which were literally just public housing. So you could view that 80% of the urban households lived under public housing. But then with the housing reform, and most of the public housing were sold, and then most of the housing that were built were market housing development. So for a very long time, China built very little, built very few affordable housing units for a very long time. I would say probably in the first 2 decades of the housing reform. And as a result of this, because of the privatization of the previous public housing units, the fact that so few new public housing, affordable housing units were built, the amount of subsidized housing in China dropped to be like less than 10% of the total housing stock by 2010. So that means it was very difficult for some of the low-income households in the urban area to to get affordable housing in China. And at the same time, we know that the housing price in China has also risen very fast. And many of them, even young professionals, were not able to purchase market housing. So that was become a big issue, that this lack of affordable housing for some of the most disadvantaged households in the urban area. That's also one of the reasons why the Chinese government decided to include affordable housing development as a pretty important component of its stimulus package. Some of the stimulus money went to support affordable housing development. But the affordable housing program in China, the landscape is also very complex, just like the affordable housing program in the U.S. I also happen to have done a lot of work on low-income housing tax credit.
Okay, I was going to mention that.
Yeah, so it's very complex. China has, just like the U.S., it has programs that support home ownership, but also has programs that, support the development of affordable rental housing. Mm-hmm. Some of the affordable housing projects were actually housing that were built for sale and to some of the middle-income families. The reason is because the market housing price, especially in some of the superstar cities, were so high, even the middle-income households were not able to purchase them. So the government has been, especially the local government, have been trying to expand what we call economic and comfortable housing, that those units receive some level of subsidy, but not very much. Maybe some modest reduction in land costs and some modest reduction in tax payment. And then these units were sold to this middle income to promote home ownership. But there were also programs that were, especially after the stimulus package, a program known as cheap rental housing. So the cheap rental housing program functions like a public housing, so that targets the most disadvantaged households, households with the lowest income, rural migrant workers. And so those households, the government has been really expanding the cheap rental housing supply to serve those households of the lowest income. Chongqing actually built a very large amount of, this cheap rental housing for some years. In general, I think if we adding all the affordable housing units together, like the goal that the Chinese government set up about 35 million affordable housing units, so that covers about 20% of urban households. So that, again, it has I would say has a broader population targeting than what the affordable housing program in the U.S. have. One of the new affordable housing program in China is what's known as a new public housing. So this new public housing units being built through government subsidies target those young professionals, college graduates, who were living in those major cities like Shenzhen, for example. And we know there was no way for them to be able to purchase housing within a foreseeable period of time. So that in China, one of the issues is that the rental housing sector is very underdeveloped in China. And so it's also very difficult for those young households to just rent or market housing by themselves because there were just not enough rental housing supply on the market. So that's where the local governments have to build these new public housing units and rent them out to those college graduates, these young households.
I can imagine with how much housing prices appreciated in China over the past few decades that there's just a lot of pressure to get people, or for people themselves to want to get into owner-occupied housing to buy a home rather than rent. And that probably explains part of the underdevelopment of the rental sector, because people feel like, well, even if I can rent affordably now, if I'm not buying now, home prices are just going to get further and further away. And so if I, the sooner I can buy, the more likely I am to ever. And if the longer I wait, the less likely it is to ever happen.
Yes.
Maybe that's actually a good transition, because that was probably the mindset for a long time. I think, development has crashed in many ways. Housing prices, I think, to some extent, too, in recent years. So before we wrap up, let's just spend a little time on where the Chinese housing market is at today. I don't really know where to start. I have not followed it closely. So Lan, I just wonder if there are any facts or policies you think are really critical for us to understand. Maybe looking at the big picture, I think I'm just generally curious about how prices and housing development have changed over the past 3 to 5 years, some of the problems that we're seeing, and maybe how some of the earlier policies we talked about, particularly the state intervention following the global financial crisis, may have contributed to that or maybe mitigated it, and how the government is responding today.
So I think first I want to point out that I haven't been able to do field work on housing in China since the pandemic. So I do not have firsthand observation about what's going on in China. But I have been reading, of course, the news coverage and also industry reports by the real estate industries, and as well as some of my own interpretation about what's going on based on my past work. So I think the issues that Chinese housing market face, there are short-term issues, but there are also long-term issues. And the short-term issue is that the impacts from the pandemic, 2 or 3 years, right? So there were a lot of production disruptions during the pandemic. A lot of housing development projects, they were not able to be finished, even though some of the housing units were the household already purchased them through the pre-sale units. So I think one of the immediate concern for China and for the Chinese government was to address this issue about these incomplete housing projects. And when these projects were not finished, and the developers, of course, were not be able to collect all the revenues back, right? They were not be able to get the funding back. So that created a lot of cash flow problem, right? That's also why, some of China's largest real estate development companies were in trouble today because they do not have enough income to pay back their debt.
And there's the developer problem, but I assume there's also the consumer, the buyer problem where it's a pre-sale. They gave the money, they paid for the home, but it's not being completed, right?
Yeah. And it's also a problem for the banks because many of their buyers, when they purchase these units through the pre-sale process, they already got loans from the banks in order to purchase those units. And if they are not getting their units, they would not be paying back those loans. And so that would also affect the banks. The bank would also be negatively affected. So that's a very serious, short-term issue. And at the same time, of course, the Chinese economy is also weakened, right, because of the pandemic and some of the geopolitical conflicts. So the housing market, I think the demand has certainly dropped to some degree. So there are not as many housing transactions as there used to be before the pandemic. So I have been saying that I think the Chinese government have been working very hard to reboost this sector and trying to rebuild, confidence about the housing market and trying to promote, encourage more new housing purchases to address, this downturn issue from both the production disruption and also this weakened overall economy. So over the long term, what I am worried about is about some of the housing oversupply issue in some of the less developed cities, in those third tier or fourth tier cities. And basically just because the demographic structure in China has changed. I think the Chinese population has not been growing because of some of the population policies. So the population does not grow as fast as it used to be. At the same time, I think the massive housing development does lead to some of the oversupply issue. Some of our research has found in both the paper we're talking today and the recent paper that, a lot of developers were building in some of the smaller places as a result of kind of expanding their development business. So that oversupply issue is something that needs to be concerned about. So in the long term.
Along those same lines, is it fair to say that the government is trying to sort of put some guardrails or constraints on the housing development industry going forward so that it's not maybe accounting for so much of the economy and the economy is not so dependent on it? And there's obviously a lot of short-term pain associated with that, both for development and maybe the housing supply overall. But there's this kind of future-looking vision where things are a little more right-sized for the economy and the population.
Yeah, certainly. I think the Chinese government has been aware of this problem for a very long time, that the real estate sector, the role of real estate sector may be only too large for the economy. And so they have been trying to shift away from those, development-driven economic models. And this was actually also reflected about how the Chinese government view housing. If you look at some of the recent policy making, right before the pandemic, there was a lot of emphasis about social equity issues, right? How do we address the issue about the housing inequality, right? How do we address the housing needs of the migrant workers? And, how can we rebalance the housing policy, not just as a driver of economic growth, but more about provide adequate housing for every household. So there was, certainly I think there has been policy adjustment and there has been, shift in some of the, the policy making process. But like you said, in the short run, it could be painful, moving away from the the old growth-driven approach to a more balanced approach, taking into consideration about what the real housing needs might be with a changing demographic landscape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of these, how do we make housing still a good investment, but also affordable?
That's true.
That challenges many countries. Yeah, I mean, so many people are invested, all of their savings is invested in real estate, but it's such a passionate and important topic. This has been such an interesting conversation. There's so many topics we could have spent a whole hour talking about by themselves. But I thought we could conclude with any thoughts you might have on lessons we could take from China's experience, either positive or negative, and maybe especially for rapidly urbanizing countries that want to build up a housing development industry and get their price elasticity of housing investment positive.
I think this question always come up, right? Whenever you talk about, housing policies in different countries, how can we learn from each other, right? But it's also the most difficult question because policy transfer is very difficult, right? Especially in terms of housing supply, as I mentioned, it's so much affected by the institutional context and also the culture, right? The history and the political economic system. So it's very hard to say, exactly what countries can learn from China. But one thing I have seen in my own research, because as I mentioned, I have been studying housing policy both in China and in the US. And one thing that strike out to me is that, kind of how much attention the Chinese government have been paying, how much effort the Chinese government has made in developing housing policy, including it as kind of very key component of its macroeconomic management policies, the importance of providing adequate housing to the Chinese government, which I have not been seeing that in the US for a very long time, right? Because housing policy was for a very long time in the US only viewed as more like a residual policy, right? A welfare policy. It's not to the level of importance it deserves as a key component of national economic development, right? Even neighborhood development. So I think that's what the Chinese government has done by looking at this housing policy holistically to look at what role it can play in terms of addressing both economic development needs, but also in terms of addressing issues about political stability, right? In terms of addressing these social equity issues. And just like the housing policy should get the level of attention and the level of care it deserves so that we could develop a sensible policy that fit what the country needs. So I feel that's kind of, for me, I think that's a big difference in my own research between these two countries. Yeah. And for some of the other developing countries, I'm sure they have their own institutional context and their own kind of, their needs. But every country, I feel that it needs to recognize about the importance of housing as part of the overall national economic development strategy.
Well, and I think that's actually a great insight for politicians. If you want to be popular, make noticeable improvements in people's lives, and then they're going to like that, right? So this, to the extent that you're able to do that within a short period of time, and get all the credit for it is a challenge, and easier in China maybe than in other countries with more turnover in governments.
Pavo, have you been listening to the 99% Invisible episodes on
Easter egg
Power Broker? I was going to say, noticeably improve people's lives, nipple, as they call it there. All right. Well, Lan, I agree with Pavo. We could have talked about each of these for another hour. I was biting my tongue on pretty much every topic we brought up to move on to the next. But thank you so much for joining us on the Housing Voice podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's a very interesting conversation. I enjoy it.
You can read more about Lan's work on our website, lewis.ucla.edu. Show notes and a transcript of the interview are there too. The Lewis Center is on social media. I'm on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips, and Pavo is at El Pavo. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.